Visual description: 3 figures holding the AUCD globe logo. Text: Welcome to the opening plenary. Hashtag AUCD2020, Achieving Equity, Leading the Way in the Next Decade.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sachin Pavitran. I'm the Policy Director at Utah State University, the UCED in Utah. I am also the current board president for AUCD. I want to welcome all of you to AUCD 2020 virtual conference. I know this year has been an interesting year with the pandemic, and many of us are dealing with the pandemic in many different ways. And my heart goes out to all of you who has either lost someone or is having different struggles that you're dealing with the current situation we find ourselves in. But with that said, AUCD, we're excited for this year's conference. The theme being Achieving Equity, Leading the Way for the Next Decade. This is the first time we're doing this virtual format. Even though this is our first attempt doing such a platform, we are very excited to bring this to our network and the larger audience. As the theme of the conference states, achieving equity, this has been an important topic area for our network over the last many years, with the leadership of many of our network leaders who have taken this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a high priority. I really strongly encourage each and every one of you to take the time to evaluate what you have going on within your centers on how are you accomplishing equity, how are you working with diversity and inclusion, and how can you challenge to make sure diversity, equity, and inclusion is a topic of high priority with everything that you do within your organization. This is an important topic for our board, who I'm very grateful to work with our board of directors who have taken this topic, not only this topic of great importance, but also really dedicating their time to make sure our network and our organization is successful in the work of policy, research, and practice. I also want to encourage all of you attending the conference to take time to observe the various agenda items that we have, but also the council activities we often have in person. These council activities are very critical for our AUCD network. It's where a lot of work happens within the conference, not just in the conference, but throughout the year. Encourage people within your centers to join these councils so they can contribute to the larger goals of our AUCD network. And for all the trainees and new leaders, emerging leaders out there, there's a place for you also to play a role on how you can be part of our network and how you can build leadership within our network. So do engage in the conversation around the emerging leaders. We have a pretty packed agenda for everyone who is joining our conference, and I'm excited that we have a great team at our AUCD office for all the hard work they have put forward to make this virtual conference a reality. I also want to recognize the incoming president, Tawara Good, who is a great friend and a mentor for many of us, including myself. And I'm excited to see what she is going to bring to our network as she will be taking the role as the president of AUCD. The next, I want to introduce our new executive director, John Cheetah, who served as acting director since January and took the role as the executive director just a couple of months ago in September. I'm excited, John, to play this role as executive director, and I'm excited to see the all the exciting work coming towards AUCD under his leadership. John's been a great friend and a great champion for all the work happening with this network. And I'm very, very glad that he is leading our organization during these times. With that said, once again, thank you all for taking time to join us in this virtual conference. And I'd like to turn the time over to John.
Thank you, Sachin. On behalf of AUCD and the entire network, I want to thank you for your leadership during this challenging year as AUCD's board president. Preparing for a virtual conference has been an interesting and at times tumultuous journey. And I want to thank the extraordinary AUCD staff and conference chair Tawara Good, who have made this event possible. Tawara had a vision back in January for a conference theme centered on equity, and we had no idea then exactly how timely, important, and relevant it would be. The annual conference is a culmination of all of our work with and in support of people with disabilities and their families. In this year especially, the focus on equity and systemic inequities resonates with us all. And the opportunity to come together virtually to explore those themes and constructs is vitally important. We are grateful for the support of our conference sponsors who have returned this year to share this virtual experience. We're once again joined by JPMorgan Chase and Anthem as platinum level sponsors. And we also welcome Walmart at that level this year. Thank you for your support. JPMorgan Chase is the sponsor of today's opening plenary, and I hope you were able to watch their short video before the session started. We're also delighted to have Pharma as a gold sponsor and Centene as a silver sponsor. We have many returning bronze level sponsors, including Verizon, Facebook, Biogen, Pfizer, and T-Mobile Accessibility, formerly Sprint Accessibility, as well as new sponsor, the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center at the University of Kentucky. Thank you. We also thank our friend level sponsors and exhibitors, all of whom are excited about the opportunity to connect with attendees virtually, access the great programming, and share information about their efforts in support of people with disabilities and their families this year and beyond. We're grateful for the continued support of all of our conference partners. And please be sure to visit their sponsor and exhibitor pages on the virtual platform to learn more about their initiatives and services. I know that your time and resources are valuable. And while I'm sorry we won't all be together in Washington, D.C. to have these important conversations and meetings, I'm thankful you've joined us from wherever you are. Our collective work to advance policies, practices, and research with and on behalf of people with disabilities must be shared and celebrated. As we look to the future at AUCD, I'm excited to work this coming year with incoming President Tawara Good from the Georgetown Center for Excellence, as well as Danny Armstrong from Miami's Mailman Center, who will chair the 2021 conference as the board president-elect. And it's now my pleasure to turn things over to Tawara to welcome you all as this year's conference chair. Thank you, Tawara, for your hard work and dedication to this network and your unwavering commitment to elevate the dialogue around equity, diversity, and inclusion in our work every day.
Thank you, John. I too am very excited to work with you in the coming year as AUCD's board president. And welcome 2020 conference attendees. I'm Tawara Good. I am director of the Georgetown University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities located in Washington, D.C., as well as the director of the Georgetown University National Center for Cultural Competence. To say this year has brought many, many challenges in our respective states, territories, and tribal nations would definitely be an understatement. In 2020, we have all witnessed and experienced unprecedented upheaval in the life of our nation. a debilitating and deadly pandemic, tragic losses, including our sense of security, loss of home, loss of employment, and sadly, the loss of life for over 250,000 people in this country. In 2020, we have witnessed and experienced racial tension, strife, and civil unrest. In 2020, we have also witnessed, and many of us have experienced, people and communities coming together in the spirit of unity and with an unyielding demand for equity for all. Initially, when developing the conference theme of achieving equity, leading the way in the next decade, I felt it was imperative for us to focus on equity and how we might explore together what equity means in the disability community. I had no idea that the events of 2020 would make the focus on equity even more urgent, not only for people with disabilities, their families, and the communities in which they live, but for our nation as a whole. This year has shed even stronger light on the many inequities that exist for people with disabilities. I couldn't have predicted how very relevant the theme would become. I hope that we can walk away from our time together with a shared understanding of what equity means in the disability space across race, ethnicity, age, gender, gender identity and expression, LGBTQ identities, geographic locale and place, and other characteristics that reflect the diversity of people in this nation. We will need commitment, energy, innovation, resilience, tenacity, and courage to move our equity agenda forward and to realize the vision of the ADA in the next decade. I also never thought that as 2020 conference chair, that I would be speaking to you via a recording. But here we are, and I am so glad that we are together, even virtually. We can share our values, lessons learned, and hopes for the future. Over the next 3 days, you will have 60 concurrent sessions and 200 poster presentations. Each day starts with a plenary session that focuses on equity from various perspectives and sectors, including champions from Capitol Hill on Wednesday. On Tuesday, we will celebrate our 2020 awardees with a pre-recorded award ceremony. Our council meetings will take place Wednesday and are open to all. There's a lot of great content this year that you can access during the conference and for 2 full months after the virtual platform. We have worked hard to ensure the virtual platform is accessible to all and have ramped up efforts this year for presentation accessibility. We hope that this proves to be an accessible and engaging experience for all of you, and we look forward to your feedback both during and after the conference via our online evaluation. And don't forget to share your experience socially. So tweet, post, and share using hashtag AUCD2020. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the hard work of AUCD staff in terms of putting this meeting together. Going from a meeting that has traditionally been face-to-face to this virtual meeting has been a significant undertaking. And I really want to acknowledge and applaud the work of the staff and all of those who also volunteered to make this a success this year. I'm now pleased to introduce and welcome our keynote speaker and panel facilitator, Daniel Dawes. Daniel will first present on the political determinants of health and a framework for health equity, and then we will shift to our panel that Daniel will facilitate. Daniel is a nationally recognized leader in the health equity movement and has led numerous efforts to address health policy issues impacting vulnerable, underserved, and marginalized populations. He is director of the Satcher Health Leadership Institute at the Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. Daniel has worked nationally within the Obama administration and as a leader in the National Working Group on Health Disparities in Health Reform to address the disparities in healthcare and health status among diverse racial and ethnic groups, people with disabilities, women, children, and the LGBTQI community. I'm thrilled that Daniel is able to share his work with us and how we might apply his health equity framework and policy experience to our own work of defining equity and framing an equity agenda for the next decade. Again, focusing on people with disabilities and their families leading the charge. We will then hear from an esteemed panel of individuals who will share their personal and professional experiences and their work to advance equity in their communities, states, territories, tribal nations, and again, nationally. Thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us today. And I will now turn things over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for that very generous introduction. It is a real honor to join you all today and talk about how we can move beyond simply nibbling around the problems of health inequities to actually effectuating meaningful and lasting changes as we move forward. So today I want to thank the Association of University Centers on Disabilities for the generous invitation to join you all and talk about the political determinants of health. We're going to be moving further upstream than we've been able to with the social determinants of health. We have a lot of ground to cover, so without further ado, let's begin. So on this screen, you see Lady Columbia, or Lady Justice, representing the United States of America. And in her hands is the scales of justice, right? This balance, where you see people falling out of the balance, right? Trying to access healthcare services, behavioral health services, and the like, but they're falling through our cracks. For too long, many people with disabilities, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals, and other vulnerable and marginalized groups have found themselves in a precarious situation. Their health, their lives have literally been hanging in the balance, many of them falling through the cracks of our health systems, our educational systems, human services systems, housing, behavioral health, and employment systems. They struggle to live in a society that has intentionally erected barrier after barrier to weaken their bodies and hasten their deaths. For over 400 years in this country, many of these groups have experienced inequities throughout the life course, from womb to tomb. The inequities in health and healthcare are widely documented, as shown on this slide with 7 tombstones, highlighting some of those inequities. Inequities such as children with developmental issues or concerns about speech were less likely to use rehabilitative services if they lived in the South. Asthma, learning disabilities, dental, speech, vision, and behavior, and emotional problems are higher among Native American, African American, and Latinx individuals. We know that if you have a mental illness in this country, 350,000 people die prematurely from mental illnesses each year. And if you have a serious mental health issue, your life expectancy is cut significantly by 25 years. If you're an LGBTQ+ youth, you're at higher risk for substance use, cancers, injuries, cardiovascular diseases, obesity, bullying, isolation, rejection, anxiety, depression, and suicide. And the list goes on. Thankfully, there have been individuals in this country who have fought for a more equitable and inclusive society. In the health space, we have defined equity as the notion that everyone should have a fair opportunity to attain their full potential, and more pragmatically, that no one should be disadvantaged from achieving this potential. Professor Tawara Good and her colleagues at the National Center for Cultural Competence at Georgetown University has proposed a more comprehensive definition of equity relative to intellectual and developmental disabilities as the absence of systematic disparities and unjust policies and practices that unfairly disadvantage individuals with developmental disabilities and their families, while unfairly advantaging individuals and families without such disabilities in the pursuit of what is needed to be fully productive, included, and valued members of their communities. So I want to share a story with you, highlighting what I think is an incredible case for why we must continue to push for equity in America, and why, with the privilege and the power that each of us have, that we must use it to advance this cause. On your slide, you see this little boy, Daquan Wimberly. an 11-year-old from Miami, Florida, who's been through many trials and tribulations in his short life. Daquan was born in 2009 with developmental disabilities and kidney failure. He had difficulty learning to sit up and walk and required special care owing to rickets, which had weakened his bones. At 18 months old, his mother was unable to continue to care for him, and he was placed in the foster system. It was fate that brought him, Daquan, to the Wimberly family, when Bishop Jerry Wimberly, with compassion and love for this little boy, 2 years later, proceeded to adopt Daquan into his family. Daquan was a happy child who attended school and frequented the hospital for regular care and dialysis treatment 3 times a week. He was an active member of his church, greeting every member who attended service. On June 19, 2020, Daquan was diagnosed with COVID-19, and with his pre-existing conditions, was considered high risk. His father was also hospitalized for COVID-19 and was admitted to the hospital. The last time Bishop Wimberly saw his son was in the emergency room of Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, where they were treating him with an inhaler to help him breathe. On July 2nd, 2020, about 2 weeks after he was diagnosed with COVID-19, Daquan fell victim to the disease, the youngest person in the state of Florida. Daquan died alone while his father recovered from COVID-19 at a different facility. Bishop Jerry Wimberly was later discharged home without his dear son, who fought to survive from his first to his very last breath on earth. You see, Daquan had a number of factors that put him at high risk of dying from COVID-19. He was Black with developmental disabilities and underlying health conditions. In fact, a recent study showed kids with developmental disabilities are slightly more likely to die from COVID-19. And the majority of kids who have died thus far from COVID-19 are racial and ethnic minorities. We know that the underlying health factors such as asthma, heart disease, and other chronic diseases strike disproportionately within communities of color, people with disabilities, and lower socioeconomic status communities. As a result, these communities experience a greater risk or are at greater risk of dying from COVID-19. The inequities that predate COVID-19 didn't suddenly appear, nor are they inapplicable. Minorities, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable communities still contend with neighborhoods that are largely devoid of necessary health protective and health sustaining resources. And they still contend with the political determinants or drivers that created, perpetuated, and exacerbated these inequities. We know that racial and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, lower SES individuals, LGBTQ+ individuals, and individuals living in rural communities die disproportionately each year, and the toll it takes is unconscionable. But the one thing that we must always remember is that in the United States, the nation's health is not an organic outcome. It is not a coincidence that certain groups of Americans experience higher premature death rates or poorer health outcomes than others. Why? Why is this happening? Well, today, as you can see on your slide, we recognize that a variety of forces collectively impact our health and determine the quality and the extent of our life on this earth, including the social and economic determinants of health, environmental determinants, economic, behavioral health, healthcare, and genetic factors. They all play a part in determining our health and life expectancy. You see, it is true that air pollution, climate change, toxic waste sites, unclean water, lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, unsafe, unsecure, and unstable housing, poor quality education, inaccessible transportation, a lack of parks and other recreational areas, and of course, other factors play an outsized role on our overall health and well-being. They increase our stress, they expose us to harmful elements, and they limit our opportunities to thrive. You see, these social determinants of health play an outsized role on these human-made pre-existing inequities. But underlying each one is a political determinant that we can no longer ignore. Today, we often stop at the social drivers of inequities, failing to dig even further to see the depths of the problem and understand its root causes and distribution. As a result, we miss the link between the social determinants of health and their political roots. This pandemic demonstrates the inconvenient and harsh truth about the impact of social determinants of health and how, collectively, these factors significantly contribute to our society's health inequities. It shows the compounding effect of political determinants over personal responsibility. Think about that for a moment. No matter how much many people with disabilities, African Americans, Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Latinx Americans, Pacific Islander Americans, and lower socioeconomic status individuals try to act responsibly, there are always structural, institutional, interpersonal, and even intrapersonal obstacles hindering them. Beneath these communities' notice are political determinants that have pulled and continue to pull strings that prevent them from achieving their optimal health and their full potential. And so, is it any wonder today why COVID hasn't been striking all groups equally? No, because our economic and social policies have not been benefiting all equally. Think about this. Who gets tested? Who gets access to healthcare and the quality of care they receive? Even accessing water, accessing food are all political determinants of health. So Daquan's story, in effect, highlights how one political determinant after another resulted in a continual tightening of a chokehold on his community and the eventual disaster that brought to light the inequities plaguing it. High obesity rates, diabetes, maternal mortality, depression, and many other health issues can be firmly linked back to political action or inaction. By understanding the political determinants of health, their origins, their impact, and their interconnection with the other determinants of health, we will be better equipped to develop and implement actionable solutions to close the health gap. What Daquan's story shows us is that behind virtually every health disparity and subsequent death, especially during this time of COVID-19, there were specific and insidious political determinants of health that led to the person's premature death. For a moment, I want to paint a picture of the tree of health for you. Initially, you may notice on your screens, on this slide, a tree, the fruit, the individuals, and even the tombstones surrounding this tree. But actually, this picture is far more representative of what our society currently has to offer some of its most vulnerable and marginalized people. The tree represents society. You see, there have always been co-laborers in the fight for health equity. Many of you, in fact, I know, are co-laborers who have tended to the tree. We have worked tirelessly to feed the tree evidence-based policies, programs, and practices with the hope that the tree would provide fruit that would benefit all of society. However, the reality is that there have been others who've been working overtime to supply the tree with that which would do it harm. These are the roots that are undergirded by racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, and many other deleterious motives. From the bottom of the tree's base, all the way up and through to the ends of its branches, what is supplied to the tree eventually is multiplied by the tree. So now, due to the root causes of inequities, the fruit represents higher rates of diabetes, inaccessible, safe, and secure housing, a lack of nutritious food, and any other number of those outcomes that we know as the social determinants of health. And as that poisonous and sometimes rotted fruit falls to the ground, the tree that had the potential to provide life-giving nourishment to all who encountered it now only leaves death and destruction in its shadow from one generation to the next. Now I want you to imagine what could and should have been. You see, the roots of the tree, which anchors the tree and is supposed to absorb nutrients from the soil, represents the political determinants of health. And the detrimental factors that the tree's roots were absorbing include racism, sexism, classism, and many other evils. Every political and policy decision that is made feeds into the tree, yielding fruit which permeates throughout our society. But if the tree of health is rooted in health equity, the end result is a society that is nourished, cared for, and capable of achieving its full potential. Daquan's story is not just a truly tragic story. It is a reminder that his death was not only preventable, but downright avoidable, if only he had been fed by a tree of health that bore life-sustaining fruit. So how did we get here? How did Daquan get to where he got, right? Let's look at this, looking at big P policy and little p policy, as you can see on the slide, big P policy representing governmental policy and little p policy. How did Daquan get to be in this situation? Why did he die prematurely? And why do we see this happening to other kids in a similar situation? Well, we know that inequality gets under our skin, and it leads to accelerated aging in our bodies. It leads to biological weathering, as Dr. Arlene Geronimus at the University of Michigan has coined. And it increases our rates of diseases, right? As other researchers have identified, like Dr. David Williams at Harvard. So what does this result in? Eventually, it destroys the social and the economic fabric of many communities. So I want you to think about it this way. Think about a cement block. And then think about a drip, a constant drip of water hitting that cement block. At first, you don't realize the impact that drip of water is having on the block, right? But over time, what's happening? It wears away at the concrete. That's essentially what's happening in many bodies today. Many of these marginalized and discriminated populations find themselves aging, right? If you looked, according to epigeneticists, if you looked at the ends of their DNA, let's say a Black individual, a Black adult who's 40 versus a white adult who's 40, oftentimes what they see in these bodies, looking at the telomeres, is advanced aging. So what should be a 40-year-old body looks to be a 60-year-old body. Again, racism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, these hurt. They impact us. So let me take us back 400 years. We talked about the social determinants of health. We understand that these are the structural conditions in which many of us are born into, which we live, we are educated in, and we work in, if we're lucky enough, right? But the question we should be asking is, how did these structural conditions come to be in the first place? They didn't just magically appear. There was an act that created it, a policy or a political determinant that created that result. So let me take us back now 400 years ago. We know 400 years ago that Massachusetts became the first colony to legalize slavery, right? And other colonies followed suit. We know that they then attempted to create and implement additional policies, as if legalizing slavery wasn't enough, right? They had to orchestrate a plan to develop additional policies to keep Black and Indigenous populations down. So these laws basically prevented these vulnerable populations from being able to address their social determinants of health. They were prohibited from raising their own food, prohibited by law from earning their own money, prohibited from learning to read and write, especially English. They were prohibited from socializing. They had to have passes in order to go beyond a 1 mile radius in many instances. They had to carry lanterns at night if they dared venture out. All of these were political determinants of health that we now know impact our health and well-being. Well, as you can imagine, from that time on, those laws, those policies were recycled from one generation to the next. We saw an effort by health equity leaders, the leaders representing people with disabilities, representing racial and ethnic minorities, representing the homeless and other vulnerable groups in this country, fighting to get policymakers to take an equity lens, fighting to get policies that would uplift the general welfare of all population groups. That was a short-earned victory in the 1860s during the Civil War. They managed, after negotiating, to get a very comprehensive health policy passed that would address these social determinants. But those protections, those policies were soon overturned by opponents of health equity. After that, we know Jim Crow reared its ugly head in this country, and at all levels of society, at all levels of government, we saw the imposition of policies, again, to deny these vulnerable groups the ability to achieve equity. What led to was then an attempt by our federal policymakers to move away from facially discriminatory policies, right, which on their face, they were explicitly racist and explicitly discriminatory towards people with disabilities, to now facially neutral policies, but again, having a disparate impact on these very communities. We know that under the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration, there was an attempt by the federal government in conjunction with state and local policymakers to intentionally segregate the United States. This law, the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act, sent property appraisers out into over 200 cities in America, and they were charged with grading these neighborhoods within a city as either an A, which were desirable communities, a B, still desirable, a C, declining, and a D, hazardous. And who do you think lived in the hazardous communities? Yes, you're absolutely right. It was African-American, Black and brown population groups, and poor whites who lived in these areas. The yellow or the C or less or declining neighborhoods were your undesirable immigrant communities. These were your Mexican, Cuban, German, Irish, Italian communities, right? And what eventually happened was these reports were compiled, they were sent back to the federal government, and the government used that to determine whether to provide FHA or VA loans to certain communities. Well, as if these communities hadn't already been starved of the resources that they needed to reach their full potential, no, the government decided to come in and completely limit their abilities to take advantage of these federal loans. And what followed suit after that period was an attempt by the federal government, or by the commercial interests rather, little p policy now, to come in, these commercial banks saying, well, if the federal government's not going to invest in these communities and create opportunities to bolster the structures of these communities, why would we ever do that? That would be a poor return on our investment. We saw the grocery chain operators doing the same thing, hospitals and other businesses refusing to go into many of these communities. And essentially what resulted was a poverty tax on these communities, right? In the form of higher payments for auto insurance, mortgage loans, lower property appraisals, and the like. It led to these food deserts, food swamps, hospital and pharmacy deserts in these communities, making it more difficult to access resources to improve health and maintain health. And then we went away from redlining these communities to actually blue lining these communities as we are entering this era of significant changes in our climate, right? In the form of climate gentrification, which is displacing many minorities, many vulnerable populations. Today, we see the impact of years and years of these political determinants of inequities, right? In the form of lower life expectancy. If you were to overlay all of these red line maps, all of these maps throughout the decades, and looked at it today in terms of the current situation, it's no surprise that the very communities that have the lowest life expectancy were the ones that have been intentionally starved of resources, intentionally redlined, intentionally discriminated because of policy. Why is this important? Because as we are moving forward in this country to becoming a more diverse nation, the Lancet, prior to COVID striking the United States, had predicted we were going to fall 21 places in terms of our life expectancy. Today, we rank 43rd among nations in terms of life expectancy. Over the next 20 years, we're expected to drop to 64th among nations. This is extremely serious, right? All the while, we have to remember that yes, policy has been a driving force for many of the health inequities we've observed in this country or experienced. But it also has been used, although relatively in a few instances, it has been used to address the political determinants of health inequities. So I want to quickly, in the last few minutes that I have, raise some of this lost history, right, and put it in context for us. William Faulkner, the great Southern writer, said that the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. How true is that today as we are experiencing this triple pandemic, not only of COVID-19, but this racial and social reckoning, this issue of behavioral health, of loneliness and depression that is consuming our country and the like, right? Well, as history would have it in this country, thankfully, there have always been a minority of leaders who have always championed, used their power and privilege, their platforms to champion health equity. We saw that right at the creation of this country of ours. There's a constitutional form of government. Once the US Congress was established, once President George Washington was seated, there was an attempt by abolitionists, by health equity leaders to put forth policy, right, that would elevate health equity. They recruited one of the major political influencers, Benjamin Franklin at the time, and they begged him, Benjamin, would you use your power and privilege and sign your name to this petition? And he read the petition and said, absolutely. Well, in that petition, they made the case for stopping the separation of children from their mothers, from stopping the breakup of enslaved families, from providing health care, medical care to vulnerable populations, those with disabilities, those who were older, women and children and the like. They fought to actually get proper clothing and food to these vulnerable groups and to provide education and real employment to these groups. Well, the Congress, if you think we're in a very heated debate over health reform in the United States, over health equity, well, back then it was even more contentious. Back then, the House and the Senate were very upset with Benjamin Franklin and these leaders for introducing such a petition. And the Senate decided, you know what, we're not even going to respond to Benjamin. We're not even going to respond to this petition. But the House said they couldn't let that go. They had to set the case once and for all that it was not the federal government's duty to become the great almoner of the people. They made basically a confederalism argument, that it was best left to the states to make those determinations as to how to take care of the general welfare of their people, because they're closest to the people, they argued, right? And so after they addressed bullet by bullet all of these concerns, by the time we got to Benjamin Franklin, unfortunately, he died 3 weeks later. And that was the first time in US history that the light of health equity in public policy had dimmed. Well, mental health reformers scrambled decades after that to try to get a comprehensive mental health reform bill passed by the US Congress. After decades of trying, they finally succeeded in 1854, getting the bill for the benefit of the indigent insane passed, right? Well, you would think that was exciting, and it was, but by the time it landed on the president's desk, President Franklin Pierce, he vetoed it. And people thought at the time that he was going to be the first president in US history to sign into law a comprehensive mental health reform law. But instead of signing it, he vetoed it, and he set the federal policy of inaction in mental health reforms for the next almost 100 years in America. After that, we would see only piecemeal legislation around this until President Carter became president and tried with Rosalind Carter, the former First Lady, to pass the Mental Health Systems Act. They would expend all 4 years of their political capital to get it done. But unfortunately, it was a little too late, because 1 month later, after it was signed, we had the 1980 election. And President Reagan won that election, and his administration went about immediately preventing further implementation of that law and started dismantling what had already been implemented in the last few months of the Carter administration. Mental health reformers were disheartened. They were extremely disappointed. And it would take another 30 years before we would get another bite at the apple through the Affordable Care Act to push the most comprehensive mental health reforms that this country has ever seen. So let me just quickly move on for the sake of time to talk about where the court stands now, right? We've been so distracted by the executive and legislative branches of our government relative to the equity agenda. But the US Supreme Court has been a little quiet, but actually has been dismantling a lot of the protections that past leaders fought so hard for. And in recent cases around civil rights, what we have seen is this recycling of an argument. So let me put it in perspective again. We know that initially during President Abraham Lincoln's time, when they had enacted the first major civil rights laws in this country, the Supreme Court at that time, who were sympathetic to the South and to slave owners, decided that these civil rights laws were unconstitutional. So they basically overturned them, and 100 years later, leaders, health equity leaders again, civil rights leaders, would try to again create similar legislation, which they succeeded in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, the Housing Act, et cetera, right? Well, what we have seen now is a court that basically has acknowledged now, right? Whereas past courts didn't acknowledge it, that there were vestiges, although I would use stronger language. They said, now vestiges of past segregation by state decree do remain in our society. Past wrongs committed by the state, and in its name are a stubborn fact of history. And stubborn facts of history linger and persist. But though we cannot escape our history, neither must we overstate its consequences in fixing legal responsibilities. Why is this alarming? Well, it's alarming for several reasons. First, the court fails to take into account the evidence from a broad spectrum of research demonstrating the lasting impact that these vestiges of slavery, of segregation, and subsequent unjustified discrimination have on population groups. Second, the court statement has a rippling effect into other case law at all levels of the judicial branch, setting a precedent for other policies commissioned by other governmental bodies. And third, the court's been arbitrarily determining the point at which these vestiges of legally sanctioned discrimination cease to significantly impact certain communities, arguing that after a certain amount of time, it doesn't matter anymore. Their argument is, get over it, right? Well, we have to connect the dots, the social determinants of health, to their political roots for this very reason. The court has been moving in a direction where they would rather view inequities in our society as products of private choices or products of the social determinants, so they don't have constitutional implications or legally enforceable remedies. All of us as equity advocates who continue to make the case that inequities are solely socially derived and fail to show the political connection will only bolster the US Supreme Court's viewpoint, thus weakening the legal protections to check these structural and institutional forms of discrimination, as well as denying legal remedies to those impacted by inequities. So in the last 3 minutes that I have, let's talk about how we can leverage the political determinants of health, right? In this triple pandemic. We know that during pandemics in the past, we have never been able to realize an equitable policy response. We have been able to do so during other crises, such as wars, natural disasters, recessions, and depressions, but never during Never, never, ever in a pandemic. So as we think about that, we need to think about how we might be able to leverage this to stem the tide of inequities and create a more equitable response moving forward so that people with disabilities, people from Black and Brown communities, LGBTQ plus individuals and others have a fair opportunity to achieve their full potential. As you see from this very wonky slide, it's a model that I created on the political determinants of health, taking evidence from history, political science, and law, among others, to understand the levers that have been pushed and pulled to effect the changes that we needed during moments of our history. These are what have worked. And the idea here is that to advance equity in the United States, you have to demonstrate the value of investing in change. In our country, advocates have to understand the disquieting and harsh truth that the political determinants of health inequities have rarely been addressed unless their reduction and elimination served other purposes. So I don't have time to go into the chart, but just note that there are so many pieces to this that we have to consider if we truly want to be effective in moving the needle of equity forward. So let me leave you with 5 things that we can do to elevate health equity in America. You know, all of these structural barriers that we've encountered, the good news is that they're not permanent, but we must do something. We must harness the power of collaboration to effect the changes. And so we have to engage in the tough conversations around race, place, and class, and advocate for a full commitment to tackling health inequities in all areas. We have to work further upstream than we've been working to address the social and the political determinants of health inequities, understanding when they are at play. We need to research the history of our communities and understand and address the past policies and programs at all levels that created and perpetuated and exacerbated these inequities. Remembering that in our country, exclusion has always been easier to realize in policy than inclusion. Then we have to strengthen our networks and engagement. We've become so complacent in many respects. We must strengthen our engagement and realize that we must not only vote, because voting will dictate how long we live and the quality of life we will have, but beyond that, we have to connect the fact that this is a continuous process. People need to be continuously engaged. We also, lastly, need to understand that health equity begins and it ends with the political determinants of health. Let me leave you with this thought by a dear mentor and friend of mine, Dr. David Satcher, who was our 16th US Surgeon General. You know, as we were talking, he reminds me all the time that, Daniel, even now more than ever, we need leaders who care enough, who know enough. They've studied these pesky determinants, these drivers of inequities in our society, these political determinants of health. They have the courage to do enough, right? They're not going to give up when that political pendulum swings, but they will have the courage to continue and they will persevere until the job is done. I think one of the reasons why we have seen a dearth of equity-focused policies in this country is because once the political pressure got too high or got too much, a lot of health equity leaders lost the political will to continue to beat back on that pendulum. I hope that we have leaders, again, who fit this description, because if we don't, health injustices, health inequities will continue to persist like they have for generations in America, unless we seriously tackle the root causes or the upstream factors, notably the political determinants of health. Thank you all so much again for the privilege of your time and for your advocacy in creating a more equitable, healthy, and inclusive society.
Visual description, AUCD conference logo. 3 figures holding the AUCD globe logo. Text, achieving equity, leading the way in the next decade. Hashtag AUCD2020 opening plenary. What is equity and what does it mean for the disability community? Visual description: smiling mixed black and white man with a short black hair, brown eyes, and black mustache. He is wearing a black suit jacket with a white dress shirt and a multicolored tie. Text: Daniel Dawes, Director, Satcher Health Leadership Institute, Morehouse School of Medicine. Visual description: smiling Asian man with short black and gray hair. He is wearing glasses, a purple shirt, and green tie. Text: Larry Lynn, Director, USC UCED at the Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. Visual description: smiling Asian woman with short black hair. Photo is in black and white. She is wearing a gray blazer and a white t-shirt. Text: Mia Ives Ruble, National Disability Rights activist and co-funder of the 2017 Women's March. Visual description: smiling Latino man with mid-length black hair. Photo is in black and white. He is wearing a white t-shirt. Text: Elver Ariza Silva, Policy Research Interests, Communication and Advocacy in Public Health, Culture and Linguistics.
I am now pleased to start the panel portion of the opening plenary, which I will be facilitating and joined by three incredible panelists who have done great work around equity, both personally and professionally, on a local, state, national, and international level. I'm joined today by Dr. Larry Yin, Mia Ives Ruble, and Elver Arias Silvas. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and also answer our first panel question. How do you define equity from a disability perspective? Why don't we start with you, Larry?
So thank you, Daniel. My name is Larry Yin, and I'm a pediatrician as well as a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and I lead our USC University Center of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities here at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And you know, with that question about defining equity from a disability perspective, I automatically usually go to my healthcare hat, and I think about health equity. And to me, it's really simply giving patients the care they need when they need it, but recognizing that in thinking about equity and in thinking about our population, you know, the population that we serve is one of the most marginalized groups and have faced inequality in health, education, vocational, psychosocial, cultural, and economic domains. And I feel that we really need to move away from treating everyone equally and recognize and accept that some populations and our populations really may need differing treatment to create more equal opportunity. So that's my kind of simplistic view and approach to things and how I view things in terms of equity.
And Larry, I really love that approach because you're right. I think in order to actually treat people equally, we have to actually treat people equitably, right? Equity leads to equality, and we're just not there yet. Mia, why don't we go with you next? Why don't you share with us, your perspectives on equity?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, my name is Mia Ives Ruble. I am a disability justice and inclusion and equity consultant. So I am from North Carolina and have been working with lots of different organizations across the country to talk about disability inclusion, disability justice, and how it interacts with so many of the other issues that people face in their everyday lives. And so when I'm talking about equity, I look at it through a very holistic lens, thinking about equity, thinking about just the thought around structures and how they systematically oppress or keep people out of their communities and out of resources. So thinking about things that provide more equity for individuals, particularly when you're looking at disability and other factors, is thinking about it not as a benefit or a perk, but as a set of policies and practices that seek to identify and understand that due to systematic historical discrimination, folks don't all start at the same playing field, right? And so, each person and each community need dynamic supports to promote fairness and justice within their communities. So thinking about it as a dynamic process, that means that we can no longer address the process in silos, but needing to understand how systems of oppression interact with each other, and how they may affect a person differently depending on their multiple identities, and how those structures and societies should treat them. So, as an individual with a disability, my other identities, whether you're talking about the fact that I'm an Asian American, that I'm a woman, or that I identify as bi, all of those factors interact with each other to create a system that is in place that keeps me from being able to get to the places that I want to get to. So thinking about how do we create new policies and structures that will help individuals like myself and like other individuals get the resources and the supports that they need to succeed in society.
Well, Mia, thank you. There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm looking forward to us unpacking some of those things. You talk about structural determinants of health. We talked earlier about political determinants of health, right? And that historical lens to many of these issues. So I'm glad you brought that up. You bring up this holistic framework, and it's one that I know Kimberly Crenshaw and others have coined in terms of intersectionality. We'll get into that shortly. But Albert, let's hear your perspective on equity from a disability perspective.
First of all, hello to everyone. What an honor to be part of this panel. I am Elver Arisa Silva. I am in Washington, D.C. right now. I am an immigrant, Latino, a person with a physical disability, but also a person with multiple abilities. For more than 20 years combined experience in human and social services in the food industry, it is the self-advocacy and the advocacy for others what has allowed me to really interact with people with disabilities of diverse cultural background, but mostly from the Latino American community, supporting them and their families to have a dignified life. How do I define equity from a disability perspective? I could possibly define equity in more than one way. Equity as a powerful value, asset that people with disabilities have in the community. Equity as the fairness, justice people with disabilities should receive when igniting their rights to speak out, to vote, and to be represented. Equity as the equality for everyone, accessing to all services regardless disability, ethnicity, cultural identities, language, gender, religion. Equity, no systemic issues found. And I can go with a list, but I do think that that is the base of how equity is found in the disability world.
Well, thank you so much. It's interesting because you all raised some, I think, cross-cutting themes about what equity is, right? And I want to explore two that I think I heard from you all. The question is, what inequities have you experienced or seen that affect people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? And please share your perspectives on intersectionality, right? Multiple statuses. I know you all raised that as well. Why don't we start with Mia?
Yeah, thank you. I ran into Kimberly Crenshaw's discussion on intersectionality and the difficulties that Black women face within America, and the fact that they are Black and that they're women. And that it's not just a checklist of, you know, who has it worse. It's not a race to the bottom. It is literally talking about how these systems interact with each other to create these inequalities. So stating that we cannot fight one equality without looking at all the other inequalities, because that just allows the continuation of power and privilege to continue on. So, an understanding that, you know, individuals who have multiple identities, whether they are Black and disabled, if they are Latinx and disabled, if they're Asian American and disabled, we all face different sorts of oppressions and structural discrimination that can make it hard for us to be able to get where we want to go. And so what happens is that oftentimes structures that already have power would rather silo it out, right? So that it makes it harder for us to understand how these structures interact with each other. So, as an individual who is an Asian American, who is an immigrant, who it also has a disability, my main priorities are often around healthcare and immigration. And those two prime instances, when we start talking about um, the policies that have recently come out that have said that, you know, individuals with pre-existing conditions, individuals with disabilities shouldn't migrate here, right? Those new policies that talk about individuals with disabilities as not helping our communities, that we are not deemed fit to actually immigrate to the US. Or the fact that we look at things like Fitzer stating that only US citizens are allowed to get the coronavirus vaccine, and how it leaves out specific individuals with who may be you know, may have exacerbated symptoms if they get COVID, and that they're left out of being able to get the vaccine. So you see it all around you. There's different ways that these systems really interact with each other to actually make disabled people who have multiple identities the most vulnerable population in the country, and we belong to every single group in the country. And that's where it just frustrates me when people don't understand how disability interacts with so many of these other things, whether it's police interactions, whether it's interactions with ICE, whether it's interactions with our healthcare system. You look at Asian Americans, who are one of the least trusting cultural groups of healthcare. Nobody talks about that, but we don't trust healthcare because there are language and cultural differences and how we perceive healthcare, but people don't talk about that. We're supposed to be seen as the model minority individuals, and we're the doctors who are out there often providing care, but we are also the people who are like, I'm not going to go to the doctor. I don't trust my doctor. They don't trust me when I talk about, you know, my own cultural perceptions on how to treat myself, and they make fun of me when I talk about it. You know, if I talk about the herbs and you know you know, homeland treatments that I like to use, and they make fun of my culture for using it, how am I going to trust these people? And then you look at the individuals with disabilities who are Asian Americans, and they're like, I don't trust my doctor, but I need this care, but my family doesn't trust them. So what do I do? But this is never talked about, right? And so this is where, you know, like, and I know I talked about a wide range of issues, but these are the things that disabled people who have multiple, you know, identities are really facing. And unfortunately, what happens is that we often talk about disability through a white lens. And so we don't get into these cross tabs where individuals really are facing a lot of different things that are never addressed within the disability community.
Well, Mia, I want to thank you for broadening our lens on these issues, right? And moving us from downstream, talking about those personal experiences, right, at the doctor's office, moving us further upstream, right, to those social, structural, and political determinants and drivers that have fueled many of these inequities. So you made a really compelling point about you can't fight one inequality without fighting all of these inequalities, without broadening the lens. And Elver, I'd be curious, especially for someone who has experienced, inequities in your health status, in terms of your multiple statuses. Can you share with us what are some of those inequities that you've also experienced or seen throughout your life course?
Absolutely. There are different inequities that myself I have experienced, but also by support disabilities. For instance, in terms of eligibility for disability services. Sometimes we see that how adults with autism and other developmental disabilities are not eligible to receive services just because it is only limited, quote, quote, limited for those with intellectual disabilities. Another is, for instance, in terms of employment. We see, or I have seen, gender inequality, more acceptance to young men with disabilities than women. Disability inequality as well. There is more opportunities, or there are more opportunities to those with physical disabilities, such as, for instance, deaf or a person who is blind, but limited opportunities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And of course, I do say this with the entire respect, I am one of them. In terms of receiving benefits, disability services, or public services, going to different entities for immigration, language inequality. I have seen all the time how there is not the appropriate language services interpretation for somebody who has a different language other than English to come and do a request. In terms of housing, I did say that before, but housing is just critical for establishing and managing behavioral health. And if we do not have housing opportunities for those folks, well, it is quite difficult for them to get that kind of stability. And others, in terms of inequity, in terms of direct care workers who meet the daily need of people with disabilities, they are so many times underpaid. They are without qualifications nor training. So they really, that kind of service or support affect people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. People with disabilities in general, we do interact with everyone at everywhere and doing everything all the time. We do things that everyone does, but we do it in a different way, but we do. And because we do, so we interact and we are part of that community. Inequity should not to be in place right now.
Thank you, Elver, for that. So, you really helped us understand how some of these social determinants of health, right, and these other determinants, behavioral health and so forth, impact our ability to reach or to achieve health equity. And Larry, I'd be curious. Elver really raised some interesting perspectives about, how even healthcare access has been limited, and even more so depending on your gender, right? If you are a woman with a disability, could you share from your perspective as a clinician, what you have seen or experienced?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, in healthcare, we've had a long history of kind of challenges with trying to change the dynamic of providing services And a lot of like well-intentioned decisions have led to a lot of inequity in healthcare. And one of the main challenges that we see is just simply an access to service and access to care. And Elver brought up a great issue just around linguistic competence. And what we've tried to do, at least in our setting, is make available interpreters at every visit, either in person or via telehealth, so that parents and families feel that they are able to at least communicate their concerns with a physician, and not be in a situation where the physician is really deciding care based on kind of this inadequate information base or structure. We continue to push that with our providers to say, listen, it's not enough for you to know a little bit of Spanish. It's not enough to know a little bit of Mandarin or Japanese or Tagalog. You need to be proficient if you're going to speak in that language. And if you're not, you need to use an interpreter. And I think that it's taken many years to get to that place, to move away from Spanglish and other different languages, so that we can better communicate with our patients, and so that our patients and their families can communicate with us about the needs that they have, and we can address each of those systematically. When I think about kind of the inequities and examples, the most recent example is just with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in this country. A group of us, the Mind Institute at Davis, the Tarshan Center at UCLA, our state council, and our Department of Developmental Services thought, what a great idea to come together and think about messaging to inform our DD community in California about the pandemic and what we need to do, and using our DDS website as that conduit for transfer of information. We soon realized very quickly that our population living in our communities didn't know what a virus was, number one, didn't know the difference between a virus and a bacterial infection, didn't know what medicines are available for treatment, and didn't know what COVID-19 really was. There was all this discussion in the news about COVID-19, and all of these things, and the precautions that need to be taken to prevent spread. And there was a lot of confusion. And our group decided we need to stop, go back into the community, understand the gaps of knowledge, understand kind of how we can then provide the information in a way that can be understood, and then deliver the messaging in kind of a broader format to kind of address those structural inequities that continue to occur. And I'm really proud of the group in that, we brought in self-advocates into this discussion. We brought in advocates, and we brought in community-based organizations who are working directly in the community with our populations to start to review messaging before it ever came out, and to say, this is what works, this doesn't resonate, this needs to be explained differently, this needs to be simplified, this needs to, just change in terms of the format or readability or presentation. And with this group that started out with COVID, we started to address the other tragedies that have happened this year around George Floyd, civil unrest, and then for us in California, the wildfires. And how do you help folks get prepared for natural disasters? These are all things that obviously this group didn't think we were going to be doing, and we continue to do that. And I think that that's kind of one way that we've started to try to address this from a systematic statewide approach from that perspective. We've done other things, and I can give examples about kind of the health equities that we've been doing locally if we have time, and I'd be happy to share that.
Sure. So, Larry, you talked about, people, closest to the pain essentially should be the ones leading the solutions. And I like the fact that you talked about some of the things you have done around linguistic and cultural competency, right? So let me start with you, Elver. What have you done to improve equity? We just heard from Larry about some of the things he's done in his community and among physicians, among clinicians, to increase their cultural and linguistic competency. But let's start with you and tell us, what have you done to improve equity in your community?
I will wish I can do more to improve equity in the community that I am or what I have done during my lifetime. But certainly, I have been a cultural broker. Fortunately, I am a person with a different ethnicity, and I do speak another language. And also getting to know the culture for me and to me are very important, or is very important, the cultural identities. I go by that. So I listen equally to each one of the people that have needs, and then develop an action plan to navigate the system and see what kind of opportunities we or there are available for this person or this family. I promote the importance of social engagement. It is so important and vital to be seen and also to see others in an environment that we share. So I promote to people when it is allowed to be in a setup that public services, everyone enjoys to have a smoothie. So why not go into a meeting at the Starbucks with a person who had a disability and the mother and the father and enjoy the time and get to the point, but be part of the community that they belong to, and everyone can see them and also they can see others. Another one is to improve equity is the integration of people with disabilities in the workforce. The workforce is a key factor of more equitable opportunities in the public, but also in the private sector. So I do work collaboratively with another partnerships, and we do find the job, not a regular job, but the job that is suitable for the person who have the disability and also the desire to do differently. I would say that also coaching, mentoring each person with a disability and their family members to become or to be an advocate, to advocate for what they believe is right and deserving for them and their loved ones.
Well, Elver, thank you for helping us to understand we really do need to do more to increase the visibility, right? Helping folks to see us, if you will. Larry, we did quickly touch on what you've been doing to improve equity relative to linguistic competence. Is there anything else you wanted to add about what else you have been doing?
It's really kind of looking at how we start to tackle structures that have been in place for many, many years based on well-intentioned rules that have created inequity. And one example has been even in our own mental health clinic, where we've had this long-standing rule to limit mental health services to only those who live near our clinics, with this idea that the best intention was we really didn't want to have folks travel great distances to reach us for kind of 1 hour appointments each week. During the pandemic and during the lockdown, we pivoted quickly to telehealth and soon realized this was our opportunity to address that structural inequality that we just created by saying you can only be seen if you lived in this geographic area. And by eliminating those geographic boundaries to care, we've been able to open up our access to patients who live far, far away from us through the use of telehealth. And we're addressing all of the telehealth issues and the technology issues now. But that's just another example of how we've tried to address a lot of the inequity that has occurred related to the pandemic, but also has become a silver lining for us to look at new strategies of how we reach into communities and provide equal access to care and going about that. I mean, we've done things like during this pandemic created hybrid visits where some families who don't have bandwidth and access to data but still have a telephone, we can participate in telephone care and then bring them in for a short visit through a drive-through clinic so they can receive immunizations, because people are fearful of coming into the hospital for their care. And so we provided different opportunities to receive care for our populations, and we've been routinely calling our families, reaching out to them instead of them reaching out to us. And so we've been trying to be preemptive about reaching into our families to make sure they're doing okay, make sure they have their supplies, make sure they have their prescriptions, and whatever else needs to be, needs to happen in providing that daily care.
How about you, Mia? What have you been doing?
Yeah, I started as I got my social work degree, seeing myself as sort of the person on the ground doing the like day-to-day in-person sort of helping people connect to services. And for a while that I felt great about that. I was doing vocational rehabilitation. So I was helping individuals with disabilities find employment and community services in their communities. And after a while, I started noticing, just feeling like we were putting band-aids on issues and not really addressing them. And so we would see this sort of continuation of seeing people cycle through our program. We would get them stabilized, but then something would happen. They'd lose their benefits, they'd lose something, their health would go downhill. And then we would see them, a year later, maybe 2 years later, back in there trying to, restart their lives. And they had to continuously do this. And I got so frustrated with that. And I was frustrated because not only, I relate so much to that as an individual with a disability who has gone through multiple hospitalizations for surgeries and feeling like you have to start over after you have had a major surgery and you have to get back on your feet and re-engage with the world. And I just got frustrated with that. And that's when I started getting involved in more community advocacy and talking about how policies were really keeping people impoverished. And these were progressive policies that we thought would be would absolve all of these inequalities, right? But they were creating more inequalities, or resulting in putting up barriers that didn't allow people to get to their full potential because they had to go through all of this paperwork or jump through these hoops, or they wouldn't be able to get a job because they could lose their health care. And so they had to decide, do they want to get a job or did they want to keep their health care? And that became just such an obvious fix, but not feeling like there was much progress on that. And so that's when I decided to go into community organizing. I started working with organizations who were going to legislatures' offices, representatives' offices, talking to people about what was happening on the ground and what people were facing in their communities. And that was really when I got to work with places like Women's March. I worked with Families Belong Together. I worked with a lot of different organizations to talk about the impacts of being disabled and dealing with these policies that these organizations were working on, whether it was for healthcare, whether it was for reproductive healthcare, whether it was around immigration or police brutality. I was working with these organizations to talk about how to connect these issues and how, much like my friend Rebecca Coakley often says, is that disabled people are kind of the canaries in the coal mine. We often face the brutalities that these policies result in first, and then they sort of spread out into the community and affect more and more people. But we are such a vulnerable population. And so for me, I began working with different organizations to talk about how to include disabled people within their policies and how to make them more representative of the people that they say that they're working with. And then I got to work with the Ford Foundation and create this, toolkit for nonprofit organizations to talk about how to be more inclusive and how to be more equitable when talking about disability and how it interacts with the issues that they're facing. So talking about how to, employ an individual with a disability, how to do workplace accommodations, how to make events accessible, and creating this like very simple toolkit for folks to use, and sort of a scaling on how to figure out where they are within the scales of how inclusive they are. And then I finally got to work with a couple of different presidential campaigns to talk about disability and to make sure that they included policies that favored individuals or helped individuals and supported individuals with disabilities. I got to work on the Warren campaign and develop one of their disability working policies, and also create a toolkit that was basically to make their private events more accessible. And then also got to work in North Carolina to talk with individuals with disabilities, to hear from them about what are the main issues that they were concerned about on the ground. And then eventually got to, continue that work even after the Warren campaign left, and continue to do that work because it's so important to make sure that we have a voice and that we are represented within these policies.
Well, it certainly sounds to me, Mia, Elver, and Larry, that you all have been extremely busy, and that's probably the ultimate understatement for the day. But in the few minutes that we have about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes actually. Let me wrap things up by asking you this, final question. And if you could take about a minute each for me, I know it's asking a lot, but what do you think needs to happen in the next year to achieve equity for people with developmental and other disabilities and their families? And how about the next 10 years? And Mia, you were talking about your work, with various presidential campaigns. Why don't we start with you there? What do you think needs to happen in next year? And then after that,
yeah, I think that we need to see the ADA as the bottom floor, the basement floor of where we need to be. We have been so far, we've been, on the defensive for so long. We need to go on the defensive and really ask and push and require, politicians, organizations to actually fund actually put money into the policies that help individuals with disabilities, and make sure that disabled people, whether they have ID or DD, that they're at the table when they're making their decisions.
thanks, Mia. How about you, Elver?
Well, I think, and to be honest, that to achieve equity in a year is quite ambitious. But of course, we can start, or we can continue doing what we have done. I would say that to establish a mandatory policy with social inclusiveness. This means in all the spectrum of the workforce. Another one could be that different employers in different areas leave liability on the side, because they believe that people with disabilities, they are going to get hurt while they are doing a task, and they will end in a lawsuit. That is not the case. I think that instead of that, establish a trusted and safety structure and environment for people with disabilities to get the job. Also, opportunities for parents and caregivers to succeed. If the parent of caregiver or caregiver really have the opportunity to do more what they are doing it right now, the person with the disability will succeed as well. And finally, I would say that embracing our cultural identities. I think that that is a key for acceptance, for respect, without leaving our own ethnicity, but sharing and taking from there.
Wonderful. And how about you, Larry?
Yeah, so, I was thinking about this too for the next year and the challenges that we're facing. And I think that we have to remain vigilant and continue to check in, continue to reach in, and continue to listen to our communities on what they need and when they need it. We need to continue to look at our existing processes and revamp these systems to meet the changing need. And I tell our group, it's really about being nimble and being able to adjust to the changing environment. And when I think about the next 10 years, I tell our group, we really need greater accountability of one another. And the systems that we have in place that provide care, we have to call each other out, and we have to agree on the same goal. I think so often we go into this, and so many people at the table have different goals. And if we can agree on one goal of equity, then we can be okay with the inequality that has to happen, so our populations get closer to equity. And so those are the messages that I continue to push forward to our group of understanding of how we're going to get to equity and access to healthcare, and how we can achieve it.
Well, let me just close our panel discussion. Thank you so much to Larry, to Elver, and Mia. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking discussion, an important dialogue around equity and disability from many great perspectives. I think there's been a lot of work that's been done so far, as we all heard today, but we also have a lot more work to do. And I'm honored to have had the chance to talk about my work around health equity and facilitate this panel. This concludes AUCD's opening plenary. I hope that you all have a great rest of the conference, and thank you.
Visual description: 3 figures holding the AUCD globe. Text: thank you for watching. Hashtag AUCD2020, achieving equity, leading the way in the next decade.